Good morning from Washington, D.C., and good evening, good afternoon, wherever you may be logging in from. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Chihoko Goto, Deputy Director for Geoeconomics with the Wilson Center's Asia program. We are excited to have you join us for discussion about Taiwan-India relations. And just to give a preliminary outlook on what we're about to discuss. We're in Washington, and we know that it's been just over a month since President Biden has taken office. And what we know so far from Washington's perspective is that there is a return to a more predictable and process-driven method of governance in Washington, where there are fewer surprises in either the actual delivery of policy or the delivery of messaging. And the White House has made it clear that it is interested in working closely together with its like-minded partners and allies in the region to deal with common threats. But at the same time, the regional order in Asia has changed considerably over the last 4 years. And the Indo-Pacific is at the heart of the emergence of new partnerships, as well as new rivalries and tensions. And it's within that context that we'd like to focus today on relations between Taiwan and India, and the growing need to reimagine regional networks and seek new paths to to work together, to cooperate, to address common concerns, and to tackle common threats. But then the question becomes, do these new realities give new impetus for furthering relations between Taipei and Delhi? So over the past year, we've seen greater visibility of Taiwan really stepping up and being a global actor. It has, of course, been exemplary in staving off COVID. It's also seen its economy surge, especially in the IT sector. But at the same time, there's been growing awareness of Taiwan's marginalization from the international community, where agencies like the WHO could actually benefit from learning from Taipei's pandemic strategy. There's also an increased awareness of Taiwan's fragile democracy in light of what's happening in Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and elsewhere. Turning to India, we see that there's growing expectations for Delhi as a critical partner in ensuring regional stability. There's refocused commitment to have Delhi play a key role in regional defense. And there's also palpable disappointment in India not being part of some of the more ambitious economic partnerships that are emerging in the region as well. There are many issues, obviously, to discuss, and I'm very delighted to be able to introduce 3 speakers today to really move forward with the conversation. First is Jennifer Chang, a research fellow at the Global Taiwan Institute based here in Washington, D.C. She was previously with the U.S. Institute for Peace, this China program. Joining us from Taipei is Sana Hashmi, who is a visiting fellow at the Taiwan-Asia Exchange Foundation. She is also affiliated with the Institute of International Relations at National Tsinghua University and a non-resident fellow at Taiwan's Next Gen Foundation. She's also an affiliated scholar with the Research Institute for Indo-Pacific Affairs of Japan and a former consultant with the Ministry of External Affairs of the Government of India. And finally, Michael Kugelman, who is a good friend and great colleague here at the Wilson Center. He is Deputy Director of the Asia Program and Senior Associate for South Asia. So with that, if I can turn first to Jennifer. Since 2016, we've seen Taiwan look more to South as well as Southeast Asia under the new southbound policy. And enhancing relations with India is key to that roadmap. Where do the mutual interests of the 2 governments lie? And has Tsai Ing-wen's strategy regarding reaching out to Delhi evolved over the years?
Well, thanks, Shihoko. I think it's an interesting time to talk about Taiwan-India relations because there have been many new developments in bilateral relations in recent months. And with much of the growth in the relationship happening over the past few years, and yet Taiwan-India relations are still limited and circumscribed, mostly due to India's traditional reluctance against upsetting China. So Taipei has always welcomed the development of ties with India since Chen Shui-bian's administration, when Vice President Annette Lu requested a visit to India to personally deliver humanitarian assistance, but was rejected by New Delhi. Both Ma Ying-jeou and Tsai Ing-wen made visits to India as private citizens prior to their presidential elections, and both presidents have sought to reach out to India. Taiwan and India have worked to boost economic and trade relations, such as by signing a bilateral investment treaty in 2002 and updating it in 2018. But there has not been progress on a potential free trade agreement. In 2019, Taiwan-India trade reached $5.7 billion, which is minuscule compared to $92.5 billion in China-India trade. And as a point of a comparison, Taiwan's trade with a much smaller country, Malaysia, stood at 30 billion in 2019, which was more than 5 times Taiwan's trade with India, suggesting that Taiwan and India have yet to reach the full potential in their economic relations. Meanwhile, the political and diplomatic aspects of bilateral relations are often constrained by India's interests and calculations vis-a-vis China, but the clashes along the China-India border in the summer of 2020 provided an opening and impetus for both Taiwan and India to enhance ties. India sent a new envoy, Grandal Das, who previously worked on U.S. affairs, to Taipei, which seemed to indicate that New Delhi was elevating its attention on Taiwan. Das met with Taiwanese lawmakers and spoke at Taiwan's Legislative Yuan, which was the first. And so India seems to be pushing its soft power in Taiwan, and it was best captured by the image of Taiwan's Foreign Minister Joseph Wu and other Taiwanese attendees dressed in traditional Indian attire for a Diwali celebration in Taipei in November of last year. These sorts of Indian cultural events have a receptive audience in Taiwan, and there's great potential in expanding more people-to-people connections and cross-cultural ties. After the fighting at the China-India border, Tsai's government casts the Sino-Indian border dispute as another focal point of Chinese contention and expansionism in the region. Joseph Wu told Indian media that China is causing problems with Japan in the East China Sea, Southeast Asian countries in the South China Sea. It's having military aggression with Taiwan, and now you have a broader border conflict with India. This is why he argues that democracies in the region should unite to counter Chinese pressure on all of these fronts. He has suggested that Taiwan and India engage in intelligence sharing on China, as he has raised with other Quad members such as Australia. Yet Taiwan has to manage its expectations for this constrained and reluctant rising power. When India took over the World Health Organization's executive board in May of last year, Taipei had expressed hope that New Delhi could take a leave no one behind stance when considering Taiwan's participation in the WHO. But India did not publicly raise the issue of Taiwan's exclusion from WHO meetings and did not join the US, Japan, and other countries, Western countries, in calling for Taipei's participation. Indian netizens did, however, voice support for Taiwan's participation in the World Health Organization and congratulated on its Double 10 National Day, even after China tried to instruct Indian media on how to appropriately report on Taiwan's National Day celebrations. Tsai Ing-wen thanked Indian social media for showing support for Taiwan, and Vice President William Lai also raised the banner of the Milk Tea Alliance when thanking Taiwan's Indian friends. A major concern is that India is not firmly part of the US camp and often pursues hedging strategies between China and the United States while seeking to benefit from both sides. There is a risk that if China-India relations were to warm up, Taiwan will be thrown to the sideline again. So therefore, Taiwan has reason to be uncertain about Indian intentions and calculations for the time being. So I'll just stop here.
Great, thank you so much, Jennifer, for that very comprehensive analysis of where we stand at the moment. Sana, You have written extensively about India's relations with Taiwan, but I was particularly struck by an op-ed you wrote for The Guardian recently, which argues that engaging with Taiwan is not a choice, but a necessity for India. With that in mind, how has the Indian government's approach to Taipei evolved over the years?
Thank you, Shihoko, and it's my pleasure to speak in this webinar today. And I appreciate Wilson Center is organizing this timely webinar on India-Taiwan relationship that has been, in my opinion, one of the most undervalued, understudied, underappreciated, and underexplored set of relations. And the potential of this relationship still remains underutilized. So the one question I have been asked numerous times is that what is in there for India to engage Taiwan proactively, especially when there is a protracted boundary dispute between India and China. But amid this recent violent standoff between India and China, we have witnessed how there have been calls to advance ties with Taiwan. And but despite these developments, if we look at the scale of cooperation or depth in the relationship, there's huge disparity when we see Taiwan's relationship with other Asian countries such as Japan and Singapore. So till the time when the KMT was in power, there was this mutual neglect and lack of ambition from both sides. But now, since the coming of the DPP and Tsai went to power, for the very first time, Taiwan is actually looking towards South Asian region with India at the core of its new southbound policy. So there were several positive developments last year, but despite those developments, what we have seen is that the G2G, the government to government, still remains limited. But 2020 was different with the relationship. And now the relations have acquired this people to people dimension, this human dimension that has put the relationship into the limelight. So now what we are seeing is that there are more convergences between India and Taiwan. And there is this unprecedented enthusiasm about Taiwan and India. First, of course, the COVID-19 response is one of the reasons how Taiwan became a talk of the town in India. And this is what my op-ed is about. You mentioned about my Guardian op-ed. And apart from COVID-19 response, there is this change in perception about China among Indians. So this is also one of the reasons for Taiwan's popularity in India. And now the domestic discourse has visibly shifted in Taiwan's favor. But even before we talk about why should India engage Taiwan and what is there in for India to engage Taiwan, I think it is also important that we look at what obstructs the relationship, what are the hurdles in India-Taiwan relationship, specifically from India's perspective. So the first is, of course, the China factor. So from India's perspective, the approach is still very restricted, despite problems with China, it still adheres to the one China policy. And even though India stopped mentioning the one China policy in the joint statements since 2010, and former Indian Foreign Minister Sushma Swaraj, she even asked China to respect one India policy if it wants India to reciprocate on the one China policy. There was clearly some rethinking on one China policy when Modi came to power. He took a few bold steps, and one of the important developments was to invite Minister Chung Kwang-Thien, who is the former representative of Taipei Economic and Cultural Center in India. Now he's the Deputy Foreign Minister in Taiwan, MOFA, along with Dr. Lobsang Sangye, President of Central Tibetan Administration, to his swearing-in ceremony in 2014. But despite these bold moves, what we have seen is that in reality, India still practices the one China policy. India has been cautious in expanding political ties and to some extent economic ties as well with Taiwan. And all these moves have symbolic relevance if not followed by the concrete actions. And this is what happened between India and Taiwan. So the momentum began to slow down sometime around 2016 when China began to oppose the increased level of interaction between the two countries, especially the visit of an all-women parliamentary delegation from Taiwan to India in 2016. So even now, despite all these years and despite all these developments, nothing much has changed on the ground from India's side. India is still very, very cautious when it comes to Taiwan. And in my opinion, this one China policy and China factor should not be a constraint. Relations with Taiwan could be easily managed while India keeps adhering to the one China policy. And in fact, when Minister Thien was leaving India, he gave an interview and he said that relations with India's relationship with Taiwan and China should go parallel. And this has been Taiwan's official policy as well. The focus is not on advancing and developing security and defense ties, but the emphasis is more on increasing the avenues of cooperation in areas that do not harm India and Taiwan's respective equations with China. But apart from China factor, I believe that the lack of motivation to take the relationship forward also poses a challenge to the prospects of India-Taiwan relationship. The absence of a long-term vision for the relationship from both sides is a problem, but fixing this problem, I believe, is mutually beneficial, and a policy rethink is in order. And it is crucial that before India initiates a policy rethink, it is well aware why it is important to engage Taiwan beyond economic consideration so that the momentum is not lost. And it is important to establish once and for all that engaging Taiwan will only bring limitless opportunities for India. And I have 5 reasons for that. The first is that as the Indo-Pacific construct is evolving, the need for the major stakeholders is to have a concerted policy towards Taiwan. And this becomes all the more relevant and important now. For India, facilitating Taiwan's participation in the Indo-Pacific will only bolster its image and resolve for ensuring a rules-based order. And Taiwan, that is a robust democracy, it will contribute further stability to the region. And in addition to that, escalation of tensions between Taiwan and China will disturb the very fabric of the Indo-Pacific. And India will also have to face repercussions of that. So in order to ensure stability, India should facilitate Taiwan's participation so that the likelihood of the conflict is evitable. And also what we have to keep in mind that India has aspirations to play a decisive role in the region, but it cannot fully realize its ambitions unless it takes some bold decisions that suits its interest and reinforces its image of a country that is not bullied by a revisionist power such as China. So for the Indo-Pacific to be truly open, transparent, and inclusive, it is the responsibility of the pioneer countries to ensure that like-minded stakeholder, that is Taiwan, is not excluded from the deliberations in the Indo-Pacific. My second point here is that Taiwan and India's external COVID-19 policies are complementary and inclusive. While Taiwan has successfully curtailed the COVID-19 at home, it has also helped countries in need by donating masks and personal protective equipment. Likewise, India is also leading in donating vaccines to countries in the neighborhood and beyond. And such inclusive policies have been at the core of the Indo-Pacific. So cooperation in the health sector between these two countries will only shape the rules-based order further. And my third point is that other like-minded countries have actively engaged Taiwan, and they have been finding alternatives to strengthen cooperation without impacting their respective ties with China. In the process, countries have also benefited from engagement with Taiwan. So there's this immense synergy in India's Act East policy and Taiwan's New Southbound policy. And I believe that Taiwan's inclusion in the Act East policy will make it more and more comprehensive. And a fourth reason for me to say that India has to engage Taiwan is that India is focused on managing tensions with China. And in the process, Taiwan has been ignored. So the fear of jeopardizing ties with China and also this lack of framework to engage Taiwan has limited the scope of the relationship, India-Taiwan relationship. So it is important for India to realize the limitation of this approach and subsequently alter its China policy. This is more important when China under Xi Jinping has shown complete disregard for countries' territorial sensitivities, and by making China-Pakistan Economic Corridor a flagship project under the BRI that passes through the disputed territory between India and Pakistan and getting involved in this prolonged boundary standoff, China has made it evident that it has no interest in resolving the dispute and ensuring lasting peace in the relationship with India. So I believe that while continuing with the dialogue with China is a part of the solution, India must also adopt a firmer approach of keeping the dispute at the forefront of all the discussions. And following the approach of not letting the dispute impact the other aspects of the relationship and sacrificing ties with Taiwan in a hope to gain tangible benefit in the boundary dispute, these approaches actually do not seem to be working anymore for India. So I believe that this is an important factor that India has to keep into consideration. And my fifth point is that the US is an important partner for India, and the new Biden administration is continuing to focus on Taiwan, the Quad, and also the Indo-Pacific. Michael is going to talk about that, so I'm not going to delve into it into more detail. But what I want to say here is that the Taiwan should be a convergent interest for both the countries, and working together to amplify Taiwan's voice should be a natural step, as Taiwan could act as a stabilizer in the region. So to conclude, I would say that while China will remain a decisive factor in the relationship, India-Taiwan relationship, it is important for India to make a distinction about Taiwan's role in the wider regional order. I also don't subscribe to this idea that Taiwan could be used as a card against China, and Taiwan has its own merit, and the utility of Taiwan will only be unidimensional once the relationship with China gets normalized, and Taiwan will be neglected again. So as a scholar of China and Taiwan studies, I believe that we really need to get over this ad hoc approach we practice when it comes to Taiwan. And this is the apt time for India to take a proactive approach towards Taiwan. But is it something that India could easily do right now? So in my opinion, considering the current state of relationship, it is not possible immediately to bring ties to an advanced level. It is going to take a lot of time, and it is going to take a sustained and interest and consistent policy and attention of both the governments to wrap up ties with each other. And the policies and approaches of India and Taiwan align in the present circumstances. So it is very important for the Indian leadership to sense the situation and adopt a long-term, consistent and active policy towards Taiwan. I end here and I welcome questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sunny. You've given us a lot of material to work with. But before I turn to Michael, I was remiss, for those who are joining us today, we are taking questions. Please tweet us at Asia Program on Twitter, or email us at asia@wilsoncenter.org. Again, tweet us at Asia Program, or email us at asia@wilsoncenter.org. So, Michael, Sana talked about the China factor considerably. We know that the Biden administration is eager to have Washington re-engage with its partners and allies in the region and refocus Washington's intention on the free and open Indo-Pacific. Where do Delhi and Taipei fit into this vision for the Indo-Pacific, and what are some of the pitfalls that might arise as a result?
Well, thanks, Shihoko. Thank you for including me in this very timely discussion with two very thoughtful analysts on India-Taiwan relations. The Biden administration will support a strong and stronger relationship between India and Taiwan, and this relationship should dovetail nicely with its Asia policy. And I say this for four reasons, which I'll briefly describe. First, both India and Taiwan, broadly speaking, share similar interests and concerns with the US in the Indo-Pacific. New Delhi and Taipei, like Washington, view Beijing's rise and its actions in the region as a threat. They both support the US vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific. And they also have many of the same friends in the region: Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, and so on. They also each have a policy that aligns with that of the US and the region. As we've already heard, India has an Act East policy that emphasizes scaling up relations with East and Southeast Asian states. And Taiwan has a new southbound policy that entails building better economic relations with South and Southeast Asian states and reducing its commercial dependence on China. Second, the Biden administration wants to see democracies working together, including in the Indo-Pacific. And this is in part because of the administration's emphasis, stated emphasis on strengthening democracy and human rights abroad, a goal that it has described as a top foreign policy priority. And this focus on democracy is probably one reason why the Biden administration has really emphasized the strength of the US relationship with Taiwan during the first few weeks of its term. And this has included inviting Taiwan's de facto ambassador in Washington to the inauguration, which I believe is the first time that that's happened before, as well as hosting her for a meeting at the State Department during the early days of the Biden administration. The Biden administration also had the USS John McCain, a naval warship, pass through the Taiwan Strait in a clear show of support for Taiwan. It did this very early on in its term. And it has emphasized the importance of helping Taiwan maintain a deterrence capacity. The new administration has also called on Taiwan to have the right to play more of a role in international organizations. And more broadly, there's been messaging from the State Department stressing a desire not only for cooperative relations with Taiwan, but also for deepening relations, and that's significant. Now, the case of India, which of course is, as we've heard, has long been a close partner of the US and will continue to be one under the Biden administration, it presents a bit of a challenge to this idea of democracies working together, that given that one could argue that India has experienced some democratic backsliding in recent years. But one theme that we've heard from Biden is his emphasis on democracies working together to strengthen democracy both at home and abroad. And he's used that to describe the US-India relationship. So I think in that sense, the Biden administration can also look at India-Taiwan cooperation as a means of helping strengthen democracy in India. A third reason why the Biden administration, I think, will support the India-Taiwan relationship is that these ties largely play out in relatively safe spaces, so to speak, in non-security spaces, mainly in areas of trade and investment, broader economic collaboration. That's where the envisioned cooperation largely lies. We're not talking about security cooperation, aside perhaps from some quiet cooperation around intelligence sharing and so on, as we heard mentioned before. This type of cooperation between India and Taiwan works well for the administration for several reasons. One is that these non-security spheres include potential for cooperation on the types of global challenges that are of great importance to Biden. Taiwan, for example, has large corporations that focus on issues like clean energy and healthcare, which are areas of considerable need in India, and also major global priorities for Biden. Another reason why the fact that the India-Taiwan level of cooperation is largely in safer non-security spheres is a good thing for the Biden administration is that it ensures, for now, that China will not feel provoked and be prompted to retaliate in potentially destabilizing ways. And that's important because Washington does not want Beijing to lash out at its Asian partners any more than it already has in recent months. And of course, it's already seen China ramp up its rhetoric and threats against Taiwan, as well as stage border incursions in India that led to a deadly clash with Indian soldiers last summer in the Ladakh region. The US does not have an interest in China staging more provocations against its key partners in the region. But this does not mean that the administration will treat China with kid gloves, which brings me to the fourth and final reason why the US will want India-Taiwan relations to move forward. While this administration does not want to do anything that could provoke China to lash out against US partners, including Taiwan and India, the US rivalry with China is now sufficiently advanced and sufficiently serious that the Biden administration will not worry about a growing relationship between two of China's top rivals being something that could antagonize Beijing. Rather, it will see India-Taiwan cooperation as something that can have an advantageous balancing effect to push back against China. So I will end there. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Michael. So Michael, you talked a lot about the convening power of democracy, especially from the perspective of the Biden administration. And Jennifer, you touched upon this issue about the Milk Tea Alliance. I'm hoping that you could expand a little bit more on what exactly that alliance is and talk about the prospect of inter-regional democratic movements that follow the values of the international liberal order, but are really homegrown in uniting countries.
Sure. So the Milk Tea Alliance is an informal civil society alliance, mostly online, and really originated when there was a spat between a Thai actor who had basically retweeted something on Hong Kong, and Chinese netizens started to attack him online. And it soon grown to gain support from other countries who drink milk tea, such as Taiwan. And so, this Milk Tea Alliance is something that is really kind of civil society driven. And so when you had the China-India border clashes in the summer of last year, Taiwanese netizens kind of raised the banner of the Milk Tea Alliance, saying, we stand with India. We both share concerns about Chinese expansionism, but it could also kind of be an indication of anti-authoritarianism, anti-military politics. So actually, Pakistan, which also drinks milk tea, has, have seen kind of the rise of the military. So in essence, you have, different groupings of the Milk Tea Alliance. But I think, going on this idea of democracy, standing up against, standing together and banding against China, I think, that is the hope that Taiwan has for India. But I personally don't think India is ideologically driven for this sort of like democracy bandwagon. I think it's more pragmatic and strategically thinking about, what is kind of the role of Taiwan and India's own national interests. And, if anything, India is more, it still wants to be the leader of the non-aligned movement, which is, mostly, in Africa. So I see how Taiwan wants to put this kind of democracy framework on India, but I'm not sure that the Indians, are primarily driven by this sort of ideological, framework. So I do think there are still constraints to having India kind of join the bandwagon, so to speak. And I think it's really dependent on what the Biden administration will do in terms of how it sets its China policy, its Indo-Pacific policy, and Indian policymakers then will, assess whether or not, the benefits of joining, further going into the US camp may outweigh, the risk of irritating China. So I think it's still, we're really need to see what Biden will do in the Indo-Pacific to affect, India's strategic calculations.
Thank you. Sana, what do you think about this whole idea of values-based diplomacy? And of course, India is the biggest democracy in the region. There is a lot of expectation for India to really carry that flag. Is that appetite in Delhi still there? Can it carry over, or is it very much a grassroots movement that doesn't have a lot of leeway at the upper echelons of government?
I think what we have to realize that sometimes approaches of Taiwan and India do not really align with each other. So whatever we saw last year and whatever we are seeing right now when it comes to Taiwan's popularity and the discussion about Taiwan and India is mostly civil society driven. So we have to see that what is government doing right now. Even though Tsai Ing-wen, she reached out to Indians through social media, through Twitter, it became a huge, it gained a lot of popularity last year. But from no one from Indian administration, any official, any leader actually responded to that. So we have to see that sometimes approaches do not really align, and national interest defining shaping foreign policy is a natural thing. So right now for India, China is the priority. Managing tensions with China is a priority right now. So if you look at it, there is disengagement going on after a year-long standoff between India and China. So even at this point of time, if Indian leadership decides to be proactive with Taiwan, is going to jeopardize the relationship with China or the progress that India has made with China over the last 1 year. So this is why I believe that civil society plays an important role in shaping the foreign policy of a country. And there's a lot of enthusiasm, there's a lot of deliberation about Taiwan, which has been going on in India. And I believe that this has a potential to be translated into political action as well. So this is why I believe that the momentum is there. So what the Taiwanese administration, government, and what the Indian government could do so that this momentum which has been generated through civil society is actually not lost.
Thank you for that. I want to turn to the issue of COVID. We've all, I think everyone's talked about the success that Taiwan has had in dealing with the pandemic. And Sana, you're actually living it right now and benefiting from Taiwan's really exemplary ability to keep the pandemic at bay. But at the same time, yes, Taiwan has been able to really promote itself as a result. And it's taken on mask diplomacy, and it's really been able to help other countries as well. But has that kind of COVID diplomacy, the ability for Taiwan to really be able to promote itself as the standard bearer, essentially, of keeping the pandemic at bay, has it hit a ceiling at this stage? We're entering a new phase where we're having vaccine nationalism. You mentioned, Sana, that India is now exporting vaccines. Taiwan is going to be an importer of vaccines. What is the next stage of COVID going to do for relations between Delhi and Taiwan? Is there going to be further cooperation, or is it going to be greater rivalry?
I think there's so much to learn from Taiwan first, and I believe that health cooperation is one of the important areas of cooperation under the new southbound policy. So I don't think there's any kind of rivalry when it comes to projecting COVID diplomacy. So first is, of course, apart from the vaccine and apart from donating medical equipment and masks, India and Taiwan were also cooperating in the traditional medicines fair. So this is also one of the areas of cooperation when we talk about health cooperation. But health cooperation is still not very evolved, and I have written in several of my publications that countries such as US and other countries such as Southeast Asian countries are benefiting from Taiwan's COVID-19 response. So India should also really reach out to Taiwan and learn from Taiwan's best practices. Of course, if you look at the size of the population, you can't really emulate the entire Taiwan model to India. It's really difficult because of the population, sheer size of the population. So I think what India could do is to have pick and choose approach and see what is best applicable to India's model and what we could actually learn from Taiwan. And being democracies, I think, so there is this China model, which is kind of an authoritarian model to deal with the COVID-19 response. And then there is this Taiwan model, which is which could be easily replicated by democracies around the world. So Taiwan has actually presented the world with Taiwan model. So I believe that we could actually learn a lot from Taiwan model. But for that, we really have to have Taiwan at a larger platform. We really need to include Taiwan in deliberations. And India being the chair of the World Executive Meeting, Health Executive Meeting, I think that India could actually do something to involve Taiwan. And so as the US, India, and all the like-minded countries should talk about including Taiwan in deliberations when it comes to COVID-19 response. So what we see is that Taiwan has actually self-sufficiently and dealt with the COVID-19, and it's doing well, and it is the country that has been able to curtail the threat, the menace from the COVID-19 response. But what we are seeing that apart from the US, not many countries have actually reached out to Taiwan, and they are not really willing to jeopardize their ties with China and to learn from Taiwan and to cooperate with Taiwan. So I think this needs to be changed, and under the framework of the Indo-Pacific, countries such as India, countries such as Japan and Singapore should reach out to Taiwan and should try to include Taiwan in larger deliberations. So I think it's very important that we do that.
Jennifer, if you could perhaps share some of your views on this.
Sure, I think the second phase is well, right now, Taiwan is working on clinical trials for its 2 vaccines, and they're both domestically produced. Right now, it's expected to perhaps go into Taiwanese arms in July of this year. So right now, Taiwan's facing a situation where it's trying to procure foreign vaccine supplies, and there is some difficulty in terms of, Chinese interference in one of the cases. So I think that if Taiwan is able to first inoculate most of its population, that perhaps it could export 2 of its vaccines to countries in need, so that, in this kind of second phase, if you will, Taiwan's diplomacy can really kind of showcase Taiwan's scientific and medicine, public health kind of expertise. But I think kind of really the challenge right now is China's own vaccine diplomacy. And we've seen some examples of how it has hurt Taiwanese interests, because in earlier this month, Taiwan was supposed to open a second Taiwan office, a representative office in Guyana, and right a few hours, maybe less than 24 hours after the foreign ministry announced it, Georgetown said, it was revoking the plan. And there have been media reports that Guyana's foreign minister had met with the charge d'affaires, a Chinese charge d'affaires in Georgetown, and after that meeting, the Chinese diplomat confirmed a certain number of vaccine doses to Guyana. So we see how China has effectively utilized its vaccine as a means to put pressure on other countries, and how that could adversely affect Taiwanese interests.
Thanks. We actually have a few questions coming in already. I'm going to turn first to a couple of the economic issues. One is from Bart Idis, Senior Associate at CSIS. He would like to ask about how India and Taiwan can strengthen their economic ties without antagonizing China, and with the potential of a formal or informal trade deal between the two sides. And then another one from Tina Chang, the Voice of America's China branch. This is probably best addressed by Jennifer, but what can you say about China's import ban on Taiwan's pineapples? What does it mean for cross-strait relations and China's clout and economic influence on countries it does business with? So anyone want to take either of those?
I think we've seen that Taiwanese government officials have already spearheaded this social media drive. And so I just saw reports this morning that Taiwanese business owners and Taiwanese people have already purchased a lot of Taiwanese pineapples. But I would say that, if India wants to make a symbolic, gesture, this would be a great time if you would have, Indians purchase Taiwanese pineapples, which are, kind of called freedom pineapples, and, kind of just show solidarity for Taiwanese. I think that would be a great goodwill gesture.
I can take the economic. As I said before, that there is this difference in approaches. So in 2000, I'll give you an example. In 2011, India was keen on having the free trade agreement. And when a delegation of Taiwanese journalists visiting India, Foreign Secretary of India, Nirupama Roy, she announced that India is willing to have FTA with Taiwan, and we are going to launch a feasibility study. And India actually sponsored a feasibility study. But at that point of time, Taiwan, under my intuition, it wasn't really keen on having something like that, because they were really focused on managing cross-strait tension. So as I said, that under KMT, there wasn't a lot of effort to engage countries such as India. There was a focus on Southeast Asia, but there wasn't any focus on South Asia. But now we saw last year that there were news about renegotiating the FTA, but I don't think it is going to take place anytime soon. But I believe that if India and Taiwan really need to elevate economic ties, they really need to have an FTA, they really need to negotiate FTA. Then there was this bilateral investment treaty that was signed in 2018. But apart from all these bilateral initiatives, I believe that under the framework of the Indo-Pacific, so India is not a part of the RCEP anymore. And then India is also not part of APEC, which Taiwan is a part of. So I believe that under the framework of the Indo-Pacific, it's very important that there is a new mechanism of which China is not a part of, and then there are like-minded countries. So I think countries such as US and India could actually come up with an economic mechanism under the Indo-Pacific. But if we talk about the bilateral economic cooperation, India has been working towards expanding its economic ties with Taiwan. And over the years, many Taiwanese firms have taken an active interest in India. And in fact, India is one of the most important markets under the among the new Southbound policy countries. And Taiwan is leading when it comes to industrial manufacturing, particularly electronics, petrochemical, and machinery. And for an IT superpower like India, collaboration with Taiwan will be a win-win situation, as Taiwan is technologically advanced in the production of computer and hardware products. So I believe there's a lot of potential in the economic sector, but I always say that there is a keen interest from India's side to elevate economic ties, and things are taking place. So this is not an area where policymakers or even the Indian government or Taiwanese government really need to worry about or stress over elevating economic ties. But I believe there are other sectors where both the sides need to take prompt action so that the momentum is not lost, and that the relationship could actually move in a positive and meaningful direction.
So, Sana, you mentioned that India actually pulled out of RCEP through its own choice because it did feel that there was a greater threat of being put at a disadvantage by being part of RCEP, namely a flooding of Chinese imports into India. But from a geostrategic perspective, there has been a lot of criticism on Delhi's choice because it's seen that it's really lost the ability to be part of this coalition to push back against Chinese economic aggressions and Chinese unfair trade practices from within a working framework. Of course, Taiwan is not part of RCEP. It has difficulties in having taking part in multilateral trade agreements. Does this, not being part of big trade deals by choice, or not being part of big trade deals because of its political considerations, does that actually give greater momentum for the two sides to work together? Perhaps, Jennifer, you can elaborate a little bit on that.
I think.
Sorry, go ahead, Son.
So I think India tried hard to be a part of the RCEP negotiations, went on for years, and in my opinion, it's a sketchy FTA, and because of the rules of origin violation, and also because of the fear of flooding of Chinese low quality goods in Indian market, and so India pulled out of the RCEP, and similarly countries that have lowered their barriers to like Japan and Australia, so they didn't create problems for India. So I believe that these are some of the reasons for India pulling out of RCEP, and but I believe that it's important that now India and Taiwan both are not there in the RCEP. It's very important that, as I've mentioned in my previous answer as well, it's important for both the sides to look for other economic mechanisms. So Indo-Pacific, I strongly believe that both the sides should actually come up with some ideas, and I think Taiwan should also take some initiatives. And I've been saying that Taiwan should come up with its own Indo-Pacific vision blueprint. If it wants to come up with ideas and provisions for economic cooperation, it should come up with those so that countries know what Taiwan expects from these countries and what could cooperation with Taiwan mean. So it's very important that I think we put a lot of emphasis on countries such as India and Japan and other countries, but we also have to put pressure on Taiwan. What does Taiwan expect from these countries? So it's very important that it becomes a two-way process, be it economic, be it political, or be it cultural. It's very important that Taiwan also takes a step forward.
One of the limitations is that the Thai government's new southbound policy is more of a concept of broadening comprehensive relations, as opposed to having a strong central government role in going to negotiate economic deals with other countries or other governments. So it's not, you don't see kind of big economic investment deals negotiated between Taipei and India. And it's really up to Taiwan's private businesses and industries to find opportunities in India. I think one of the drawbacks is that India doesn't have a strong manufacturing base. So when you talk about kind of decoupling from China and trying to, for Taiwanese businesses to kind of shift their production bases elsewhere. India is not kind of the top of the list. Most of them are going to go to Southeast Asia. So I think oftentimes you have a government with diplomatic, political objectives and hoping to use economic means to, bring the two sides together. But I think in the case of Taiwan, if it doesn't make commercial sense, it's just going to go to, a better, favorable climates such as Southeast Asia. And I think India, for its part, it has to liberalize its foreign trade restrictions. There has been promising news of India agreeing to, for Taiwanese companies to make, smartphones, for example, but it has to really, liberalize its foreign trade investment practices and restrictions so that it would be more amenable for Taiwanese businesses.
Chihoko, can I weigh in just for a second? So, getting back to that good question about, how the two can cooperate in ways that won't antagonize China, at least some of the areas that we've heard that have been publicized, potential areas for cooperation between the two, things like tourism, educational exchanges, Taiwanese investment in India's cricket industry. To me, these seem like pretty safe spaces, safe areas to go. Now, who knows what's happening more privately behind the scenes, but in terms of these, it seems to me the areas that are being touted publicly, these don't strike me as the types of areas that would raise the risks of antagonizing China. One other point I wanted to make, which maybe better poses a question to Sana and Jennifer, is that I understand that the semiconductor industry in Taiwan is a pretty big deal, and it produces quite a few of them in terms of the world's share. And Raja Mohan, who I think we all know is a noted strategic thinker in India, his latest column had essentially argued that semiconductor industry could provide a break or a deterrent to actions that could raise the risk of a conflict in the Taiwan Strait, just because the US is apparently quite dependent on these semiconductors, and China is to an extent as well. I don't know to what extent Taiwanese semiconductors play into Indian calculations, but that industry in Taiwan, how does that play into this conversation? Is that something that is worth thinking about a lot more? Because I really would, it's better question to be posed to Sana and Jennifer, if either of you want to comment on it.
Yeah, I think Taiwan's TSMC has really emerged as a new facet in Taiwanese diplomacy. So actually, when I think it was like in February, Germany actually asked for Taiwan's help in encouraging TSMC to produce more automobile semiconductor chips, and to really ease kind of the global shortage in light of kind of the US-China trade tensions. And actually the Taiwanese diplomat the Taiwanese economic minister had kind of asked Germany as well if Taiwan can also get vaccines in exchange. And this has actually come up in Taiwan as a potential bartering, I guess, of Taiwan semiconductor chips for vaccines. And in light of the Chinese ban on Taiwanese imports. You have opposition politicians saying, well, why don't we strike back by, banning, these chips from China, just, stop sending it to China. So I think it has really emerged as maybe a new front that, in Taiwanese diplomacy, but also in its relations with Western countries such as the US. The Biden administration has also been asking for help in addition to Germany. So, I think it would kind of become a good mix of utilizing Taiwan's comparative advantages to achieve its diplomatic goal.
Yeah, I think India is one of the fastest growing mobile phone markets in the world, and Taiwan is home to the world's two largest contract chip makers, and agreements are already in place. So this is one area where India is really keen on cooperating with Taiwan. And some Taiwanese companies have already taken advantage of opportunities in India. So I believe that this is one area. And also TSMC has an office in India. So there's already a lot of cooperation which is going on in this sector. And I believe that when it comes to semiconductors economy, there's a lot of associations, there are a lot of agencies and offices that are already in place. So even if it's not at the highest government level, it is happening at track 1.5 dialogue or at the senior official level. So I believe this is happening. It might be slow, and when we compare it with other countries, it might be relatively slower, but this is still happening. But the thing is, when we just focus on one aspect of the relationship, what happens in India-Taiwan relationship is that other aspects get neglected. So I think it's very important that we keep focusing and we give equal importance to other aspects of the relationship as well.
Okay, so speaking of other aspects of the relationship, I have a question from Phil Autry at the State Department. Could you talk about opportunities for cooperation in cultural outreach and soft power diplomacy?
I can take this question as I keep talking about that. And I believe that even people-to-people ties are, the potential of people-to-people ties is also underutilized. And specifically when the New Southern policy talks about elevating cultural ties and people-to-people ties. So I believe that it's also very important that we focus on people-to-people ties. And I believe that when so I'm in Taipei, I'm going to give you an example that I have a problem which I have faced. I'm in Taipei and I really don't see any Taiwanese academician and a scholar who's actually focusing on India in Taipei. So I believe that under New Southern policy, it's very important that we motivate more and more academic and think tank interactions between India and Taiwan, more and more MOUs between Taiwanese and Indian think tanks. I think it's very important. And also tourism is also below its potential. A lot of Indians go to places like Thailand and Singapore, but if we talk to Indians, you would realize that they won't even know that they could actually come to Taiwan, and Taiwan is a potential tourist destination. So, and this is happening despite Taiwan Tourism Bureau having an office in India. So the number of Indian and Taiwanese tourists visiting each other country is below 40,000. So this is nothing, because if you see the Indian population, we are 1.2 billion people and only 40,000 people coming to Taiwan. I think there's a lot of potential in this area. So I believe first is academic exchanges, then second is tourism, and also there are Indian students in Taiwan, but the number is just 2,000 to 3,000, and these students are mostly in the sciences field. So I believe that there is a need, especially under the New Southern policy, to encourage students to take up courses in the social sciences, to take up language courses. So most of the Indian students still believe that they could only go to China to learn Mandarin, and Taiwan is not an option for them. Of course, there is traditional Chinese, but the thing is that there's more awareness about the fellowship and the scholarship provided by the government. There will be more applications. So I was just talking to a scholar 2 days back, Taiwanese scholar who's in India, and he was telling me that he invited applications. So the institute is affiliated with invited applications for from Chinese students to come to India. He received a lot of applications, but the next year when he invited Taiwanese students application, he just received 15 to 20 applications. So the number is abysmally low. So I believe there's a lot of potential in all these sectors, but the problem is lack of awareness. So I think it's very important that the two countries focus on generating awareness. And this is my favorite sentence, and I'm going to say it again, that the basics in India-Taiwan relationship are not in place. Even before we talk about elevating ties, even before we talk about elevating defense and economic ties, we have to really focus on the people-to-people ties and how to elevate cultural ties. I think it's very important. And for that, I also believe that there's not even a single Indian correspondent stationed in Taipei. And especially when we see that there is so much censorship in China, a lot of foreign correspondents are choosing to come to Taipei. So we see that there is not even a single Indian correspondent who's stationed in Taiwan. So there's a lot of potential, and I believe that to generate awareness and to make people more Taiwanese and Indians more aware about each other and to elevate the relationship, it's important that the awareness is generated.
Great. Jennifer, I'm going to turn to you for the final comments on that.
Sure, I generally agree with Sana. I think India has great soft power appeal. I'm thinking back to Modi's International Day of Yoga and also the Diwali celebration that occurred in Taipei. So I think there is a receptive audience in Taiwan, especially among young people, to learn more about Indian culture. I think that also going off of Mandarin language courses, I think, now that, Confucius Institutes worldwide have, kind of been scrapped or kind of seen as being too closely tied to the Chinese government, I think Taiwan could take the initiative to, better promote its Mandarin, language courses. And, Indian diplomats are very surprisingly, a lot of them are fluent in Mandarin. So I think, maybe Taiwan could have some training programs for young and, aspiring, Indian diplomats or, policymakers. If they want to get Mandarin language training, Taiwan would be, an ideal fit. So I think there are definitely areas in which both sides can work together. And I agree with Sana that, maybe it's better to kind of build the foundation first by just getting to know each other and having more people-to-people ties, whether it's through educational exchanges or tourism, before talking about kind of the bigger strategic picture.
Absolutely. People-to-people exchange really does matter. And we know with COVID, technology has actually been able to bring us closer together, but I think we're all very anxious about the day we can actually meet in person and have these personal exchanges and have these student exchanges as well. I want to thank you all for joining us today, but before we sign up, first of all, a big thank you to the Asia Program's intern, Anastasia Gracheva, as well as to my colleagues in the audiovisual department, Tracy Fitzgerald and Jared Thompson. Thank you, Sana Hashmi, Jennifer Chang, for joining us today and for allowing us to have this very in-depth discussion about relations between Delhi and Taipei. And thank you all for joining us today, and we hope to see you again soon. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.